So, um, a while ago, I was at some parishioner's house whose sister was visiting, and her sister grew up and lived in the deep south. And the parishioners moved away from here, so now I can talk about them. They're actually really sweet people, and they invited me over for dinner and drinks to meet their relatives. And a small tangent. They offered me a vodka Collins, and I'm not a big drinker, truth be known, but different alcohol has different effect on me. I don't know if it's like that with you, but beer makes me a little slower and indifferent. Vodka, as my friends have pointed out, one sip of vodka, and suddenly I'm like, I love you, and I love you. I don't know why, vodka makes me joyful. And it doesn't take much. And it also makes me a little bit what I'll call forthright. So I have this nice vodka, and I'm meeting this family, and the sister, who's not Catholic, she's some sort of fundamentalist, the sister goes off and says, well, evil is overtaking the world. And she went off on this, evil is, look at all the evil in the world, evil is taking over. I don't know, that didn't drive with my vodka. So, like I said, you gotta be kidding. You believe that? And I said, I know that there's evil in the world, but you grew up in the 1950s in the Deep South. Like I told you, I read that book, Warmth of Other Suns. In the 1950s, it was legal to lynch people. In the 1950s, this teenage black boy held open the door to this white woman, and she didn't like his attitude, so she had him lynched, and he was skinned alive. If you were black or Hispanic, the 1950s in the South not only had white and colored drinking fountains, you were openly persecuted. So I said, if you're white and come from the upper class and you're a beautiful young teenager, I'm sure the South was idyllic. But it wasn't. It was oppressive towards a lot of people. You're just coming out of the bubble. You lived in this bubble that made it look like it was paradise. And now you've woken up and realized there is evil and persecution in the world. But it was far more in the 1950s. And she didn't seem to understand my point. She thought evil was taking over the world. And I will not argue that there is evil in the world. And she also said, and I thought this was amazing, she says, look at the Middle East. They're fighting in the Middle East. When haven't they been fighting in the Middle East? And yes, I actually even believe Al-Qaeda is in the United States now. And not to scare you, but yes, I do believe they want to kill us. But when hasn't there been violence and war and persecution? That just because you're coming out of the bubble and realizing it now doesn't mean Satan is taking over. In fact, I believe the opposite. There's actually this TED Talk, I'm into TED Talks, where this guy mathematically proves that the world is becoming, if you look over centuries, the world is becoming less and less violent. Now, I'm not good at math. I think it's part of the dark arts of magic. But I do believe in the gospel. And in today's gospel, the two parables Jesus gives is that the kingdom of God is growing. It's getting stronger, not weaker. And so, I think it's really odd, maybe because of the 24/7 news channel, but I just have met some people like this woman, God bless her, whose reaction to the evil in the world is to hunker down in hate and anger. And I have a friend who's a very good person, but he has this whole pantry stocked because he thinks, the end of the world is coming. Now, I think you should have a fully stocked pantry just because you don't know what's going to happen in wintertime, and you might have to feed me. I just think that's wise, but he is armed to the teeth with ammo and everything. And I think that's a really sad reaction to live with such fear and anger. Yes, I believe the kingdom of God is here and growing stronger and stronger. And in the civil rights movement, if you look at Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, when they went out to protest, it's really interesting. They first had these schools of practicing justice, where one, you'd pray, which oddly enough we're doing today. You have to pray. Two, you have to practice not reacting with anger. So they would actually rehearse this, where let's say you're going to demonstrate. They would argue and yell obscenities at you, and you must not get mad. They'd dress very professionally. And just another tension that I thought was interesting in the civil rights is that you had this tension between two things. One, you must do something now. You know, you must act now. There's this urgency that there's all this injustice, and you have to do something. The opposite of that is this. You also have to practice patience and hope, because justice may not come in our lifetime, but we're going to push it forward a couple inches. And whether it comes in our lifetime or not, we're going to be patient and hopeful. And what's interesting about that tension is that Jesus gives some parables that make that point about urgency. You must act now. And then Jesus also gives the opposite parables, like the two that he gave this morning, where it's you must practice patience and hope. And often truth is paradoxical. You know, really, truth is paradoxical. It's two opposite things at once. There is an urgency, but you also must be patient. And like the parable about the seed getting planted, that slowly, and there's a stalk and then more. That's actually about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is like somebody who planted a seed. And the seed is barely visible. It's tiny and vulnerable. Think about the beginning of the early church. Jesus just started with 12 apostles. It was very, very small. And those 12 apostles who are charged with bringing in the kingdom of God versus the power of the Roman Empire, they controlled everything. They were brutal and powerful. And yet, in the parable, the point is, the power of God is behind the seed, not behind the Roman Empire. And so, the God who exists outside of time and space, the Roman Empire will come and go. The seed will stay. It will bloom and grow, and it did. And my favorite, in the Greek, it says about the seed that the seed will sprout. You could translate it automatically, but what it literally says is the seed will sprout in a nature's way. And why I like that nature's way, remember, the early church, one of our titles was the people of the way. The way of nature is the way of growing justice and peace. The way of violence and injustice, that's what's unnatural. And nature will win out. God and nature will win out. The kingdom of God is growing stronger over the last 2,000 years, not weaker. And so I don't understand, like, this woman or other people who hunker down in fear and anger that there's violence in the world. Or kind of the same point as the second parable of the mustard seed, where Jesus says, the mustard seed is the tiniest of all seeds. I hate to argue with God, but technically that's not quite true. The tiniest seed is actually the orchid seed that is so small it's a speck of dust. But it's not like the apostles would know what an orchid is. But a mustard seed, it's the size of the head of a pin. It's very tiny. And the other thing, a little background, the other thing that he said, a mustard seed, this would have shocked the Jews and the Greeks who heard this story. The reason why is in Judaism, it says in the Mishnah that you are prohibited from planting mustard seeds, because the problem with the mustard is that It's actually a weed that once if you plant it, it will take over everything. So the fact that Jesus said a mustard seed says the kingdom of God will take over. For Greeks, Pliny the Elder said that you should not plant mustard seed because it holds the ground and it refuses to give up. But he does mention the fact that mustard is actually a natural remedy. It's a healing plant. But don't plant it or it'll take over. The idea is that the kingdom of God, it might be very tiny, but once it takes root, it is very stubborn. It will take over. And I believe over the centuries, we've grown and grown and grown. We're going to take over. We're winning. And then Jesus says something bizarre. He says a couple things bizarre. He says, and then the mustard seed, it's a shrub. And then he said the shrub will turn into this tree. Jesus knows shrubs don't turn into trees. He's actually making a point that this weed that was unwelcomed, that the early church really was. Remember, for 300 years, we're a persecuted religion. But this little shrub is going to turn into this huge tree, this institution, which it did. And then he says, and this is a shocking part, and birds of the air will find a nesting home in this tree. What do the birds symbolize? The birds symbolize everybody outside of religion who is not welcomed by religion. That would be us Gentiles. In Judaism, remember, the 12 apostles were Jews. Jesus may have welcomed us Gentiles, but the apostles were a little slow. But we get welcomed into the church. We're part of the birds. Lepers. Remember, lepers were not allowed to worship in community. The sick, the dying, those who are ill, they're part of the birds who will find a home in the kingdom of God. And it always makes you think, in the church, every generation, some outside group finds a home. And what is going to be the next birds that find a home in the kingdom of God? That our church is supposed to bring in the kingdom of God, where many people who are persecuted find a home. Look at, for example, another issue, women's rights. In my generation, women are treated fairly well in the United States. I was shocked I was actually shocked when I went and lived in third world countries. In one country I lived in, women, and they're good people, but women weren't allowed to wear shoes unless a man had shoes and I thought this was amazing, because that would put a woman above a man. So she literally wasn't around. I was kind of shocked. Or when I went to the Middle East, Turkey, and I saw women in this blistering heat wearing these heavy black burqas. Come on. In that heat, that's just a way of persecuting women. And yet, look at in the early church. In the early church, you have all these virgin martyrs. They're martyrs because in Roman society, you marry who you're told to marry, who your parents tell you to marry, which I think we should return to. But these women, I was joking, these women, with Christianity, they felt themselves free, that they could marry who they want. And that was not acceptable by the Roman Empire. So that's why they were martyred. But the point being is that may have been persecuted before, but now, women, you can marry who you want. And the point being is that the kingdom of God is growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And yes, I think there is great evil in the world. And I will not be surprised if some persecution happens. It could. Evil is illogical. There's always going to be some sort of persecution. We might know safety for a short while, but that's just living in the bubble. Probably the next persecution to come is against good-looking people. In that case, you and I are doomed. But if persecution does come, no problem. I'll face it. But the woman, getting back to the cocktail, the woman who thinks evil is taking over in the world, I'm kind of shocked how many people live in that kind of anger and fear and dare to call themselves Christians. We believe the kingdom of God is growing. It started off very small, and now it's become very big. And there'll be more and more justice. And so there is this urgency. You must fight for justice, but we also must practice patience and hope. That we'll have hope. We're not going to fold just because there's evil in the world and hunker down and hide, or be angry at the world because there's persecutions. The same way Martin Luther King trained people to practice patience, that's what Jesus is doing in these parables of the seed. And what greater proof do you need that over 2,000 years of great persecution, we've continued to grow and grow and grow? So why not believe in the natural way that the kingdom of justice and peace and unity and love, it's not growing weaker, it's growing stronger. We have nothing to fear.